Several Denver Broncos are in need of bounce-back years here in 2024. Can Mike McGlinchey have a bounce-back year? We'll break it all down here on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, as always, you can get Locked on Broncos for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So make sure you do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on what's going on with the Broncos. You get all the best news, content, coverage, analysis, and more here every single day, all year long, especially through the offseason, because for the true fan, there is never an offseason. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. We're going to really focus in on today's episode of the show, talking about players we feel like really need a bounce-back season from a veteran standpoint here. And Sayre, to be honest with you, there's one guy who the Broncos signed in free agency last year that came in, really, really lucrative financial deal for him, and also maybe for the Broncos addressing a position that has been a little bit of a turnstile for the last decade or so. Mike McGlinchey didn't have the greatest year from an optics standpoint in terms of performance. He is one of these players that we've identified early on here as, hey, needs a bounce-back year in 2024, I think, to maybe make Broncos Country feel a little bit more easier about that signing initially. I don't believe in necessarily writing a guy off yet, but Mike has to have a better year in 2024 than he did in 2023.
He definitely does. And I think the Broncos are obviously counting on that based on the fact of what they've invested in him. I mean, they've invested a ton of money in him. They gave him the only 5-year deal in free agency last offseason out of any unrestricted free agent, which is pretty crazy to think about. I mean, they believe that he can be a building block for this team. And I think we saw on the positive side, Cody, I mean, Mike McGlinchey seems like a really good guy. You would know better than me, but he became a captain, I mean, right away. And I think that kind of shocked a lot of people, didn't he? I mean, he's just somebody that you're already looking to in the locker room, like somebody that people are seeing, hey, he came from a winning organization and somebody that he's a prominent voice for the team already. It's just, I think that was great to see. But the not so endearing nickname of McGlinchey surfaced all throughout the 2023 NFL season. I mean, it was almost a weekly occurrence where you would see Mike McGlinchey have a false start penalty here and a critical situation there. I mean, it was not necessarily just like, hey, at the beginning of a drive, McGlinchey, he's off or he's not on with the snap count or whatever the case may be. I mean, it was that pretty poorly, there's never a good time for a penalty, but there were a lot of poorly timed false starts from Mike McGlinchey that were kind of not always drive killers, but maybe momentum killers, or they slowed down the momentum. So it was more so than just the pass protection issues. It was the pre-snap penalties. And it was these types of things that you wouldn't really expect of, first of all, a guy who was a first-round pick, but second of all, a guy who's now got a big money contract. He's a veteran in the NFL, even playing in a new city, Cody. I think that was maybe the most concerning thing, was the persistent false start penalties, the pre-snap issues all throughout the season.
Yeah, and I would say, like, while he struggled in pass protection, which, we've kind of noted when he was signed, that was kind of an area where coming into it, there was some concern about his consistency there. But I will say this, the areas in where I felt like he was very productive for the Broncos was in the run game. In terms of his run blocking ability, I felt like the Broncos got some good benefit from him there. He obviously will have to sharpen up his pass protection here. And then, like you mentioned, with the pre-snap penalties, that's something that really drives Sean Payton nuts. And, for a guy like McGlinchey, who's a captain, and that was a consistent issue, you have to look at it and it's like, hey, you have to fix it. Because, the common discussion when we talk about it from a sports psychology standpoint, right? If you're having so many pre-snap penalties, you're thinking way too much, right? And ideally, is that necessarily something relative to scheme, or is it just how do you calm the player's nervous system down in a situation like that? I can tell you this. I mean, that, like Mike McGlinchey, he won the Denver Williams Good Guy Award this year. This is a guy who acknowledged that, hey, I didn't play that great. I'm not happy with my performance. He's always a guy who's taken accountability. And I would say, like, that's a breath of fresh air because, sometimes you don't always get that. Like Mike, we didn't even have to ask him. Like, there were times Mike said, hey, I'm the big reason why we didn't win this game, or like I could have done a little bit more to help the team win. I didn't hold up my end of the bargain. Like, you love to hear that from players. Now, does it change the outcome of a game? No, but you like that there's guys in there that understand, like, hey, how I'm playing is not getting it done, right? And I think when you look back at 2023, I don't want to make an excuse for Mike McGlinchey, right? Because he was playing in the Kyle Shanahan system for a variety of years. Last year was his first year in a brand new offensive scheme. Now, in terms of performance, maybe that had something to do with it, right? But in terms of the penalties, there is no excuse in that regard for him. I think one of the bigger things here, if the Broncos, Sayre, really go out this year, and let's say in the NFL draft here in about a week and a half, 2 weeks' time, they go out and they get a quarterback, they have to find every way possible to protect him. Because look, with Garrett Bowles potentially, this being his last year in Denver, not sure what Denver's answer at left tackle is going to be in the future. Mike McGlinchey coming off of a rough year. That's not necessarily inspiring to a quarterback coming into this system. So you're going to have to also change that a little bit and maybe give some confidence to that young guy if the Broncos do in fact go that route.
And not only that, but I think you just want to make sure that you have confidence that you can have a balanced attack offensively. Like Mike McGlinchey, we know that he can run block. And so the Broncos, I mean, you expected that from him coming in. You expected him to be an upper tier run blocker and be able to set the tone on that right side, because playing next to Quinn Miners, Cody, I mean, that was the exciting, enticing thing about bringing in Mike McGlinchey, is you figured, well, with him and Quinn Miners on the right side, I mean, Broncos are going to be able to run over people in that direction. And so that there's certain elements of every aspect of his game that need to get better in 2024. And some people may be out there listening thinking like, well, shoot, I mean, this guy's been in the league since what, 2018? I mean, how much better is he going to get? I do think that, like, it's not about untapped potential at this point. It's about refinement of the game. If you're like me, you're 34 going on 35 years old, I mean, I still think I can get better at stuff, Cody. I mean, I'm not a professional football player, but you feel like you can still hone your craft in certain ways, or you feel like the more you do something, the better at it you become. So I feel like with McGlinchey, now that he's entering year 2 in Denver, I'm gonna go ahead and renew my subscription on McGlinchey this year and say I think he's gonna have a much better year. I'm gonna say that I think he's gonna be much better in pass protection. He's gonna cut down the pre-snap penalties. We might as well just speak it into existence, if nothing else, right? I mean, let's hope, because hey, the Broncos invested a lot in him. He's going to be there regardless, so we might as well hope for the best.
I like the point that you brought up about having Quinn Miners right next to him, because I do agree with you. I think that the right side is probably the strongest side for the Broncos. Now, remember the Titans, it's left side, strong side. This year, it needs to be right side, strong side here for the Broncos offensive line. I think with those two, with Mike's size, like for him, he's tall for an offensive tackle, really, really tall, and he's got really good wingspan. And then you have like the brute physicality of Quinn Miners. Denver has to find a way, in my opinion, this year. I would like to see some pulls from Quinn Miners pulling from right to left, maybe even some tackle pulls as well from McGlinchey from right to left. Like, can the Broncos diversify their run blocking scheme a little bit more this year to maybe get these guys in a position to bury dudes? And that can open up the run game even further, which I think will help out in terms of the Broncos offense, who is also in need of themselves of bouncing back in 2024. There is another player, though, that missed the last 2 seasons due to injury that the Broncos believe heavily in, why Tim Patrick needs a bounce back year here in 2024. We'll break all that down and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos. Today's Locked on Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether that's a supercharger, a roof rack, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices that you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Once again, that's ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers.
Here's a hot take for you, Broncos fans. Tim Patrick, 2024 Comeback Player of the Year in the NFL. Hey, 2 straight years with season-ending injuries. Maybe Tim Patrick is ready to come back with a brand new jersey number and get the job done again for the Denver Broncos with his clutch catches and big-time performance in the red zone. We're going to talk about Timmy P and why he's in line for a bounce-back year in 2024, but want to say thank you to every single one of you Broncos fans out there that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere that you listen to podcasts. And Cody, look, I mean, people who watch us on YouTube, they get to see all the different stuff. Maybe a cat will appear. Maybe a different jersey will appear behind me. So if you're watching on YouTube, we appreciate you as well. And if you're not watching on YouTube yet, you missed out on an opportunity to see Cody's cat again. What are you doing? Go subscribe on the YouTube page. But let's talk about Tim Patrick, Cody, because I think now, Broncos fans may be wondering who the heck is number 12 out there when they see number 12 out there this offseason. It's Tim Patrick. He changed to his college number that he wore at Utah. Maybe a little bad juju, I guess, or something like that with the number 81. I don't know what his situation is there. If he's just like, you know what, that number's cursed for me now. I'm done with that. I'm done with 81. He's moving on to number 12. Could we see Tim Patrick bounce back, or these 2 season-ending injuries that he suffered the last 2 years, is that going to prevent any sort of real comeback that's worthy of even discussing?
I don't think so. And look, I think him is a guy, Sayre, that has obviously been through a lot, like not even just in his NFL career, but his college career. Like the injury he suffered in college, ideally for most people would have been a career ender, right? And for him to go through that and to be able to come back and like build himself and like get on an NFL roster, really turn heads. And I think it was when the Broncos, if I'm not mistaken, I think when the Broncos saw him when they were at joint training camp practices with the San Francisco 49ers initially years ago when the no-fly zone was around and he was catching everything. And they were like, hey, like, this is a guy that we want to bring into the mix. And obviously, we really got introduced to Tim Patrick. I think it was when Justin Simmons made his first career start at safety. It was at home against the then Oakland Raiders. If I'm not mistaken, that's not the interception one, right? Or that was the one where Tim Patrick went up. I mean, Justin went up for the interception, but Tim caught a pass from, I think it was Case Keenum. And then, no, that's not. That was the other year. Okay, now I'm thinking of 2018. We saw him in 2018 really emerge onto the scene for Denver. Sorry about that, Broncos country. That catch from Case Keenum on third down, got out of bounds, set up the game-winning field goal from Brandon McManus, and then the Broncos beat the Raiders to obviously get a big win there. That's where we really started to see Tim. And I would even say in that season we saw Tim Patrick emerge, especially against the Kansas City Chiefs at Arrowhead Stadium. Like Tim put together some very, very underrated tape and has been one of their better blockers. So for him to go through everything that he has gone through, Sayre, I think that this injury, obviously an Achilles, it's always tough, right? You have an ACL one year, you have an Achilles the next year. Those used to be career enders. Those used to be death sentences. But with medical advancement and just seeing what Tim was able to do at the end of last year, Sayre, watching him run on the field, cut, do explosive things, I was very impressed to see how far along he is. So to me, to my understanding, he's going to be fully ready to go for the start of OTAs and for minicamp, and I think for training camp as well, which is a promising sign to be able to see there. Though I think the Broncos could exercise caution and maybe saying, hey, we're just going to hit the pause button here, Tim. We don't need to rush you out there to go run routes on air right now. And like voluntary OTAs, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, they really want to get him there, I think, for training camp. And ideally, I even think in training camp, there's going to be an emphasis on not doing too much because you have 2 season-ending injuries like that. You want to preserve the wear and tear. And I think that's something that the Broncos plan to do. But I think Tim is absolutely in the conversation here to be a candidate, to have a great season, to have a potential comeback player of the year type of year. And he's got that chip on his shoulder. I can tell you that just from seeing him and just from talking to him at times in the locker room last year. Tim is very, very focused on coming back and having a good year. But with that said, Sayre, we got to talk about what are some realistic expectations. Now, while Tim is going to set the bar high for himself this upcoming year, sometimes when you're coming off of an injury, it takes time. Like we saw it with Courtland Sutton. It took several years for Courtland to come back from the ACL to be who he really is. And then now you're talking about Tim, who's got an ACL one year, Achilles in the next year. Like that right there, that's hard. So where do our expectations kind of lie here for a guy like Tim Patrick?
It's tough to really say, right? Because of the 2 season-ending injuries, but also, I mean, what is the target share going to look like for the Broncos in the passing game this year? I mean, last year I think was a really unfair curve to grade on because the running backs, the top 3 players on this team in terms of overall touches were all running backs, and the passing game was really filtered through those backs as well. I mean, it was constantly dump offs to Javonte, dump offs to Samaje Perine. and there was no tight end involvement. There was very little involvement from the group of wide receivers as a whole. It was so sporadic all over the place. So in an ideal world, like what share of the targets is Tim Patrick really going to get? Because you've got Cortland Sutton coming back, Marvin Mims taking an expanded role. You just signed Josh Reynolds in free agency. We've talked about how we hope Greg Dulcich can stay healthy. And if the Broncos don't buy Greg Dulcich, I mean, we like Lucas Kroll, or we think that they're going to potentially go after a tight end in the draft. So realistically, how many targets is Timmy P looking at this year? And I think that's where he really needs to maximize every opportunity that he's given, whether it's red zone opportunities, whether it's, hey, we're going 4 wide, or if it's a third down play. And I think Tim Patrick has done a great job of kind of endearing himself to whatever quarterback the Broncos have brought in. I mean, he was probably the most consistent offensive player in both 2020 and 2021 for this team. Certainly when Teddy Bridgewater was the quarterback, I think he was kind of the favored target there. And we thought that he was going to be maybe Russell Wilson's favorite guy because of the chemistry that they had developed that was notable even at Russell's first training camp. So there's this disconnect between, yes, the injuries, but also the target share, but also, man, who's maximized their opportunities more than Tim Patrick when he's been on the field? I mean, when you throw him the ball, what did he have? 0 drops in 2021. I mean, that was an incredible year for him. And just you throw him the ball deep, he makes a play. You throw him the ball in the red zone, he can get the feet down. You throw him the ball near the sideline, he's got great body control. You throw him the ball over the middle of the field, he can make plays after the catch. So there's so much to love about him, but the question marks are very big. I mean, it's the injuries and it's the target share. So realistically, what can we expect? Is a comeback player of the year situation in the cards? I don't know. That's tough. That's really going to be tough. But if anybody can do it, I mean, like you said, he's got the chip on his shoulder.
If I had to give like a target range, I think just a realistic expectation for Tim this upcoming season, I think anywhere between 45 and 50 targets for Tim, I think is a realistic starting point here for Denver. And look, that can either increase or decrease. Obviously, Denver added Josh Reynolds into the mix. There's Marvin Mims, who's supposed to be featured a lot more inside of this offense. You have Cortland, who's obviously returning off of a 10-touchdown season. You know, for a guy like Tim, I don't think we can say right now, hey, Tim, you're going to come back and you're going to catch 8 touchdown passes. I mean, I would be okay if Tim just came in and caught 3 or 4 touchdowns, right? And they were crucial catches that helped the Broncos win a game. Like, I think you had to just build up from where you're at, because Tim is also playing for another contract here, not only just for the Broncos, potentially for another team in the National Football League. So I think that is something we do have to keep an eye on here for him. And I can tell you that Sean Payton had really big plans for Tim before his injury. And I think where he was featured inside of that role offensively alongside Cortland, alongside Jerry, just watching it formationally, when they would go trips bunch and they would have Tim as the guy who's the number 2 receiver. He was on the line there, or he was off the ball when he had, maybe the outside receiver, number 1 guy, his foot was on the line. They had different route concepts that they were running that I feel like if Tim was healthy and if they could have been able to run these things last year more consistently, I guarantee you, Tim, we saw Brandon Johnson have some production in that role that Tim was supposed to play. I can't help but imagine what it may have looked like if Tim was there rather than Brandon Johnson last season. So I think that is something to kind of keep an eye on here as we go about OTAs. Voluntary OTAs begin on April 15th, and then you're going to go through different phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 3 is where things get probably the most exciting as we get toward the buildup toward training camp, because the helmets come on. There is no live contact, but you get to see some 7-on-7. You get to see some 9-on-7, some 11-on-11 on air with no contact. That's the stuff we're all looking forward to. And I'm looking forward to seeing how Tim Patrick looks in that number 12 jersey going forward here. But Broncos Country, we want to hear from you on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. What would it take, in your opinion? What are some realistic expectations for Tim Patrick as he looks to make it through after back-to-back season-ending injuries suffered in training camp? Let us know here if you're listening or watching Locked On Broncos. But we are going to talk about one more player who's facing a contract year in 2024. How can Javonte Williams bounce back from 2023? We'll break it all down on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Will Javonte Williams return to form in 2024 after a little bit of a rough season in 2023? We're going to answer that here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. Real quick, wanted to say thank you so much once again to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, Locked On Broncos is available for you for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We're almost close to 12,000 total subscribers on YouTube. So Broncos Country, do your thing. If you haven't done so already, subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on with your team here. To kind of close out today's episode of the show, we're talking about players here on Locked On Broncos who may be in need of a bounce back season. I think when we talk about veteran players, we're looking at Javonte Williams this upcoming year and didn't have the greatest 2023 for the Broncos. Had moments. We saw some flashes where it's like, all right, hey, there's the Javonte Williams that we know and love. And then we saw moments where like, that doesn't look like Javonte. Now, it's not just all on Javonte. There's a lot of different moving pieces here for the Broncos offense that struggled mightily last season in a lot of key areas, including running the ball, that factor into it. But for Javonte, first year back last year, coming off of a major knee injury, his recovery and his ability to be ready for the start of training camp was miraculous in and of itself. But I think we also have to ask ourselves, did he come back a little too soon last year? That's, I think, a question we got to throw out here.
And I think it looked like he kind of did at times, Cody. I mean, we saw the yards per carry dip to about 3.6 on average, and we saw his yards after contact decrease. We saw really a lot of ineffectiveness in the passing game from Javonte, some uncharacteristic drops, or just, not a lot of juice after the catch. And so I think that there were, like you said, there were very, I guess, glimpses throughout the course of the season where we saw that guy that was, getting angry run scepters in his rookie season and dragging the entire Baltimore Ravens defense for a huge gain down the field. Like, that player is who the Broncos desperately needed last year at the running back position. And they just didn't have it. And I think that would have made Russell Wilson better. But unfortunately, the lack of a consistent passing game, constantly being put into bad down and distance situations, constantly having to play from behind because you're going 3 and out early in the games, or you're turning the ball over early in games. Like, those factors, I think, contributed most heavily to why Javonte wasn't overall effective this past season, in addition to just coming back from that injury, maybe getting his feet back underneath him. But Cody, the concerning thing for me is this. I saw a statistic shared by Andrew Mason, and he said something about the ESPN analytics ranking the Broncos 3rd in the NFL in run block win rate and 8th in pass block win rate. So when we talk about the staggering difference between, hey, your offensive line is doing the job and you have your guys behind them that aren't doing their job. Like, we've talked about how Russell was sacked 45 times last year. Pro Football Focus counted the Broncos offensive line with just 16 sacks allowed. So do the math on the difference there. I think maybe one of those same principles could be applied here when you talk about being a top 5 team in run block win rate, according to ESPN at least. Winning blocks up front and your running backs aren't doing the job behind you. It's an interesting dilemma that we're looking at here, because Javonte is going to be counted on big time in his 4th NFL season.
And I will say there were moments on film last year where it looked like Javonte at times hesitated sometimes, or didn't hit the right hole sometimes and tried to extend it out. Like, we saw that a little bit. And I even think in the season he got hurt in 2022, we also saw a little bit of that, especially against the Houston Texans. I remember he had to fight and claw for every single yard that season for the Broncos. And I mean, unfortunately, we saw how the disaster was there under Nathaniel Hackett. But, for a guy like Javonte, this is a guy who just consistently puts his head down. He works. He's quiet. He doesn't really buy too much into the headlines or the clicks or whatever's going out there about him. Like, this is a guy who just generally concerned with, hey, how can I get better? We look at maybe his struggle in production. Also look at Samaje Perine. Also look at Jaleel McLaughlin. Like, there were times last year Jaleel looked like the most effective rusher for the Broncos. And then midway through the season, he couldn't even get a couple of yards without getting hit. So part of me is like, we look at things like run block win rate. Like, and for me, I want to look at it as like, okay, so ESPN's looking at it this way. What does that mean, right? If you're successful in run block win rate, but you're not running the ball effectively, is that a running back issue, or is it maybe a story that's not being told fully about the Broncos offense or the scheme itself? Like, that is where I have a little bit of question about that, because ideally, if you're telling me the Broncos have a top 4, top 5 run block win rate, they should have one of the top rushing offenses in the National Football League if that's the case. So I'm very, very curious to see what Sean Payton puts in place this year. I even know himself, like Sean told us at the end of the year press conference, there's things he's got to do better as a play caller, but he said that they have to make some refinements to some of the schemes that they're running. And how much of that is predicated on the scheme built around last year's quarterback versus maybe what Sean ideally wants for his guys in this system, with regardless, like it's Jarrett Stidham or it's going to be a rookie quarterback. Now, we'll say this, though. In those 2 games, Jarrett Stidham started at quarterback. We talk about pass protection. I mean, he got sacked as well, and it was pretty rough in terms of the Broncos' offensive line. And then you look at the running rate or the run success rate. Like, Denver didn't have a lot of success in the run game either in those final 2 games of the season. So I think that when you look at it from a compounded standpoint, I think there were moments where the Broncos were good at running the ball. They were good at times in pass protection. But overall, there was times where they maybe set something up, but they couldn't finish it. Football is such an intricate sport, especially when you talk about your 11 guys need to get the best of the other team's 11 guys on that side of the ball or side of the field. That's where you run into a lot of the issues, is that when one guy messes up, it could impact the entire operation, right? So the offensive line in totality could do a great job of setting up maybe some holes, but if the running back doesn't see it, well, then it sets everybody back. I think there was just a combination of all of that last year for the Broncos. I do think Javonte being more healthy coming into this season, I think, is going to help. I think that the Broncos are going to keep him fresh, especially in training camp. I don't think we're going to see a lot of run for him inside the NFL preseason, but I do expect Javonte to have a bounce back year in 2024.
And I think, Cody, to your points there, I mean, it would be fascinating to hear directly from Sean Payton on this subject entirely, is to say, hey, just so you know, I mean, ESPN said you guys had the 3rd best run block win rate, and Pro Football Focus says that your O-line only accounted for 16 total sacks last season, and yet Russell was sacked this amount of times. I mean, what was the disconnect? You and I talked about this on the podcast a number of times throughout last season. It felt like the Broncos at one point or another during the season, it felt like Javonte was the best back. And then at another point, it felt like Jalil was the best back. And at another point, it felt like Samaje was the best back. They ultimately weren't able to stick with anybody as far as like, hey, we're going to ride this guy every single week. And you're right. Situation dictated so much of that. How many post-game press conferences did we hear Sean Payton have to explain, why'd you guys abandon the run? Why didn't you guys continue running the ball? Well, we had to throw the ball because we're playing from down 2 scores, you know? So, I mean, there's so much situational context, so much game context that goes into it. But I agree with you. I think Javonte can be much better this season, and it's going to be a direct result of the quarterback play being better. The Broncos were bottom 10 in the NFL last year in quarterback or passing game efficiency, not just quarterback efficiency, but the passing game was not on point. They didn't throw for many first downs last year. They were constantly going 3 and out. They had too many fumbles from the quarterback position. I mean, it was a group effort, like you said. And so with a more efficient passing game, you extend drives, you're able to run the ball more. That's going to make Javonte more effective. Go figure, getting him more opportunities, getting, maybe a lead or 2 this coming season. I mean, not that the Broncos are going to just be dominating teams by 2 scores every week, and Javonte is going to be able to go out there and just run out the clock. But maybe situationally, things will be a lot different if the Broncos do have a bit of a bread and butter, as we so often said they didn't in the passing game like last season.
Well, you need a good butter knife in order to spread it on your toast every morning. Hopefully the Broncos can do that on the offensive side of the ball here this upcoming season. But Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show. Please let us know your thoughts on these 3 players we identified here today: Mike McGlinchey, Tim Patrick, and Javonte Williams, as some veteran players who are in need of some bounce-back seasons here in 2024. For all you everydayers out there, Monday's episode of Locked On Broncos, we just have 2 remaining, folks. 2 Mondays where it's a mock draft Monday. We're going to dive into one where we're going to stay put at pick number 12. We're going to see where the Broncos fall in the latest mock draft. You can get that on Monday's brand new episode of the show.